All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kubernetes Cluster API Azure, our weekly office hours meeting or general meeting. As you probably know, we are a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and therefore we abide by the general Kubernetes community rules of conduct, which essentially can be summarized as let's try to be kind to each other and treat people as you would wish to be treated. And let's reuse the raise hand feature in Zoom so we don't talk over each other. If you need access to this document that I'm sharing, there's a link at the top. If you need to edit it, that is. I'm assuming you can get to it. Yeah, and then here at the beginning of the meeting, we give some time for anybody who's new here to identify themselves and say what's up if they wish to. So I'll be quiet for a minute, and please feel free to unmute and say hello.
Hey guys, this is Ubaid.
Hey guys, this is Vineet.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Bashish.
Awesome. Thanks for coming. I'm assuming you have something on the agenda, or we will find out. But thanks for coming. Let's see. Oh yeah, and if you feel like adding your name to the attendees list here, please do. Otherwise, let's move on to open discussion. And first thing is, someone is asking how to get rid of public IP requirements for setting up CAPZ with AKS. I'm not sure who asked this, so please.
Yes, so this is Vineet and Obaid. So we basically asked this question. Sorry, I forgot that I write my name here.
Oh, it's
so
fine.
just a background, we are trying to set up the CAPZ on AKS. We try to do it on VMSS also, virtual machines on Azure. But right now, our focus is to set up management cluster on AKS, and we are getting a lot of issues setting up that. And one of the problem is like having this public IP requirement, because the client that we are working in, we don't have public IPs available for AKS clusters. So Obaid can talk about more, but that's one of the problems that we have been struggling for last 1 week or so. So, we need actually some kind of help or some workaround if you guys can propose. Hey, Jack.
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah. Hey, so I assume this public IP is on the API server? The essentially the control plane endpoint for the cluster, is that right?
Hi, this is Ubaid. So I can give a background. So we have extracted the template of type of flavor AKS, and in Azure Managed Control Plane, we made the cluster private. And then in the machine pools, we mentioned that no public IPs there as well. But when the cluster is provisioning, we see a load balancer asking for one public IP. And I've read that it's an immutable property, but I still wish to disable it or at least make it private, so that the request for public IP does not exist in this private cluster. So that's the feature which I was challenged to find or perhaps update in the template.
Okay, and is this a workload cluster, or is this the management cluster? Like, how are you creating this AKS cluster through CAPZ, through Cluster API?
That's right. So it is a management cluster.
How are you creating the cluster? Through the
Okay, so
through the portal or?
No. Okay, so here's the thing. As a bootstrap cluster, I've used Kind and deployed CAPZ on it and generated a template. So this one is a worker cluster in essence, but I wish to delete the Kind cluster and do the cluster CTL move to make this. Yeah,
I understand. Okay, cool. So you're using CAPZ to create the AKS cluster, and then you move the management cluster components to that cluster, so that it now becomes promoted to a management cluster. But the workflow to create the AKS cluster is coming from CAPZ.
Right.
Okay, cool. So the first thing I'll mention is that there's a sort of relatively new feature, uh, a new API to create AKS clusters in CAPZ, which reuses something called Azure Service Operator, which is are you familiar with Azure Service Operator? I'm happy to explain, but don't want to waste your time if you already know what I mean.
I have seen that come up in the logs, and it also brings me to another question of SPN being replaced by workload identity. So we are seeing a federated credential issue in our logs as well. So
Great. Are you reusing the kind Bootstrap scripts that are in the CAPZ repository that we use for CI and testing?
that's right.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that conversion has been made in the last several months, in response to our own internal heightened security requirements. But that's not necessarily imposed on all of our customers. But anyway, let's set that aside for a second. What I'm trying to describe is that there's a new API in alpha, and the intentions are to promote that to beta in the next 6 months, that exposes the Azure Service Operator APIs directly in the CAPZ template. And so Matt's typing in chat here, he's typing ASO. So ASO stands for Azure Service Operator. So what ASO is a Kubernetes CRD resource representation of a particular Azure service API. So the AKS ASO representation includes, or a particular version of the AKS API includes the entire AKS API specification. So that allows you to create any flavor of AKS cluster you wish, including, assuming it exists, the particular type of public IP configuration you'd like on your AKS cluster. So what will need to happen is that you'll need to use, when you're building this AKS cluster as part of your workflow in CAPZ, you'll need to use this new version of the AKS APIs in CAPZ, and the YAML is going to look a little bit different for the managed cluster configuration, but you'll have access to the full set of configuration that, I assume that there is a way to create the AKS cluster in the desired configuration that you're looking for. Anyway, I think the best place is we can chat async on Slack, and I can guide you to that API and help you formulate a new template. But I suspect what's happening is that the public IP configuration that you wish isn't exposed in the CAPZ APIs that you're using. So we need to get you onto this new API, which exposes the ASO AKS API, which has the full set of configuration for AKS. Does all this make sense what I'm saying?
I'm able to relate. I'm on the CAPZ version 1.7.4, and that's being the latest. The ASO API that we were specifying, I just need is it a different flavor that I need to extract the template out of CAPZ, or?
Yeah, let me quickly in chat, I'll paste a link to the test reference templates that we use to test this.
Okay.
So this is not going to have the full set of AKS configuration, but let's see. So for example, Matt, if you can observe chat and then click on that link, we can kind of talk through it for a second.
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, I think there is a 1.8 release of CAPZ, so there is a newer release. Sorry, you're talking about Cluster API 1.7.4. 1.8 has not yet landed. It's almost there. I was thinking we released CAPZ 1.16 recently.
All right.
Okay. I see my hand is still raised. I'm going to lower that. So cool. Can everybody see Matt's screen? I can see it just fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So everything I've been talking about can be sort of explained at a very, very high level on lines 16 and 17 there. This is a new alpha API, and the CRD that you're going to be tapping into is a new CRD called Azure ASO Managed Control Plane. So you're probably familiar with Azure Managed Control Plane. So this is a new CRD definition. So if we scroll down a little bit, you can start to, if you're familiar with the existing API, you'll see that the spec looks a little different here. So instead of, there's a little bit of boilerplate wrapping here, which essentially instructs CapZ to thinly wrap the specified underlying resource type that's there in that resources array. And then you reuse the configuration spec that resource defines. So in this case, for our Azure ASO managed control plane, we're referring to a resource of kind managed cluster of API version container service.azure.com/ blah, blah, blah. That's an ASO resource declaration right there. So we're saying we're basically instructing CapZ that we're going to specify a CRD that is of this type. So we're reusing the ASO type there. And then in the spec definition, starting at line 29, this is going to look somewhat familiar to the existing Azure managed control plane and Azure managed cluster configuration, but this is the ASO spec, which is very, very tightly bound to the underlying AKS API spec that it publishes. So ASO is essentially an automated outcome of wrapping various Azure APIs and then exposing them as Kubernetes CRDs. So it allows you to do sort of more general purpose cluster API type gestures. So you can just essentially you install the ASO controllers on your Kubernetes cluster, and then you can create any Azure any Azure resource that ASO supports in this kind of way where you create a new CRD, you could create a load balancer type, you could create a VM, and you can imagine all the Azure sort of resource primitives. So can you scroll back up, Matt? So in this spec, starting at line 29, we define the configuration of our AKS cluster. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to convert your templates to use this API flavor. And hopefully, if you're familiar enough with Kubernetes and how this all works, you should be able to sort of figure this out. And then you're going to want to use, I'm going to paste another link in chat. You're going to want to use this reference. Where is container service? Okay, so stand by. So here's a link to a reference ASO documentation that is going to help you populate the contents of that spec. So if you go back to the CRD, you can see that we define the V1 API 2023-1001. Let's see how my short-term memory is. And there, Matt is pointing to this is the spec. This is the reference documentation. So if you click on the managed cluster link there, Matt, for 2023-1001, this is obviously auto-generated, Java doc style output, but this exposes the entire AKS specification that you now have access to use in CapZ. So to bring this all back and summarize, the purpose of this, there is a little bit, or maybe you could argue more than a little bit of additional boilerplate overhead that the user has to absorb in order to use this new API. But the trade-off is that you get access to the entire AKS feature set, because that is what ASO's job is to continually, as AKS APIs are published, ASO consumes those and generates new CRDs that represent that new API. So by having CapZ reuse this ASO API spec, we are able to keep up to date with a relatively small amount of latency with the progress of the AKS service offering going forward. So you get access to basically all the features of AKS, with the exception that there is some lag. AKS, exposes some new features, it publishes a new API. Then we have to wait for ASO to consume that and publish its wrapping on top of that. And then CapZ in turn will have to consume the latest ASO. So there's a little bit of lag there, but certainly not to the extent that we have using the legacy CapZ APIs. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Does this make sense?
Yes, I am able to relate. There's quite a bit of reading that I need to go through. But if there's any specific field that I can disable this load balancer creation altogether, is there something like that that I can refer?
Yeah, I was kind of trying to scan for something
Yeah,
like that.
I don't know that off the top of my head. I mean, do you want to just essentially create a private AKS cluster?
Absolutely, yes, that's the intent.
Got it.
So
Then
there's enable
I would
private
just,
cluster.
Yeah, we have marked it
yeah,
true.
say, click on that. Sorry, I'm not muted. Cool. Yeah, I think this is what you want. So you want that Boolean to be set to true in your CAPZ spec.
Yeah.
And this should do have the outcome that you wish where there's no public IP on the API server.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, so the problem which I ran into was, even though when I marked this as true, it still was asking for one IP for
Really?
load balancer. That's where I was not able to get to make it to 0, or at least to false.
Right. That might have to do with the service load balancer that's created in advance to accommodate service creation on the cluster for actual workloads running on the cluster.
Yeah,
So I feel like I've talked enough about how you can get access to the full AKS API feature spec. So I think the important thing at this point is to figure out how to create an AKS cluster, maybe even just using the portal or using the command line. So separate from CAPZ, if you can figure out how to create the desired AKS cluster that fulfills your requirements, and then you can translate those to the ASO spec, and then you can consume that configuration in the new CAPZ spec, if that makes sense. I think that's the path forward.
Sure. So I'll give it a try, and I can reach out on Slack. Right?
sure. There's also this load balancer profile, although it's not obvious to me that this would. So I don't know. There's several things that might apply. I'll put these links in the document too, just for reference, because that will help.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for all that, Jack. That's a pretty good tour of the current state of CAPZ, really. Do you guys, are there any more questions about this? We have a
separate topic. I have a separate topic to discuss it. Yeah.
Okay.
Is it okay to bring it up now?
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Only other thing on here is sort of a clerical issue, so go for it.
So with the latest version of CAPZ 1.7.4, we have seen that the identity that is being generated is workload identity. Previous version has SPN. Now the error in the log says that SPN is soon to be decommissioned, or perhaps on those lines. Workload identity. So I was checking out to see exact features of, or perhaps the requirements to create them, and was not able to find that. So is there some document or perhaps some template that can be used pre-generated? I see that we are creating this service principal using the secret tenant and app ID with the combination of resource group subscription, not the resource group. Yeah. So when we plugged that in, we still found the error saying that federated ID was not generated in Azure. That's the reason why the cluster was not coming up.
Ooh. That sounds suspicious. Yeah, go ahead, Jack. I have one idea, but go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt. Go ahead. You can finish your thought.
It sounds suspiciously like the policy change that is making it difficult for us to provision clusters too. Where they're essentially saying that federated ID isn't from one of our trusted sources. It's from they're really, yeah. So I think we've run into a similar error, but what do you think, Jack?
Well, I suspect it's probably just not. I mean, this is super, super complicated. So if not well understood, just expecting it to work is not likely to succeed, unfortunately. So it's taken a bunch of time on the part of the maintainers of CAPC to figure out how to get this to work in CI. One thing I want to point out in just in the notes, so the 174 is the version of Cluster API, so that's totally unrelated here. So probably change that to 116.0. That's the version which has the reference to more workload ID configuration in our CI scripts. I would advise you to do some homework and evaluate if you want to use workload ID. And if you don't understand it or you decide not to, and in the meantime, just so you don't break yourself, feel free to refer to the previous. Just ignore the changes in CAPZ CI scripts. There's nothing. None of those changes are a requirement of CAPZ. That's all for our CI. So if you have previous known working flows using service principles, and if that's appropriate for your environment, I would just continue to use those and evaluate this as a separate work stream so you don't block yourself. There's no requirement. There's no new requirement from CAPZ to use workload ID, if that makes sense. So you could just check out 115 or 114 of the CAPZ repository and use those CI scripts as reference if you want to continue to reuse those as reference scripts for your own bootstrapping environment. Or if you already have reference to previous known working, just use those old ones. There's no, does this make sense what I'm saying? Like all the CI and test template, this is just part of our testing. It's not an integral part of the CAPZ API contract for users.
And that would work with the combination of the ASO that we discussed.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. All of the things that we've converted in our CI have been possible for us to use for a long, long time. We just haven't been using them in our CI. And so we've made a concerted effort to convert the way that we're creating clusters in CI to use a much more complex flavor that leverages workload identity. But this has been something that's possible to use for a long, long time. We just haven't been using it. So the conversion of all of our CI scripts from service principles to workload identity does not constitute any change in the CAPZ APIs whatsoever.
It was just the log that kind of gave a panic attack to our client, so we have to bring this up.
All right, is that relatively clear?
Yes, thank you.
There's obvious advantages to using workload ID and all that in the long term, or not using secrets, but it's not hopefully a requirement we're imposing on users yet.
Okay. So, Obed, let's get rid of this workload identity. We can just continue working with service principal.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you have your own reference, bootstrapping methodology that used to work, you can totally continue to use it. There's nothing in CAPZ 116 that breaks that in terms of the core APIs and the controllers.
Cool. Okay, any other questions about this?
Obed, Vinit, do you have any question? I have few.
I don't have any.
Obed?
No questions, thank you.
Jack, we did observe, we are from same team, Vinit, Obed, and myself. When we are encountering this public IP need, in the portal, there is a NAT gateway getting auto-created. So we are looking to understand what's the technical need of such resource getting created.
Yes, that's a good question. The technical need is for outbound, essentially for egress from your cluster to the public internet. So some actor needs to be responsible for wrapping the private traffic outward with a public IP so that it has a route back inward. So there are two, I think there are two, there might be more, but there are at least two flavors of how to do this on an AKS cluster. One is the sort of legacy traditional way of doing it, which is that the load balancer, the Azure load balancer sort of primitive or resource type, has NAT as a feature for backend pool members. So if you create a load balancer and then you add devices to the backend pool behind the load balancer, the typical use case for a load balancer with backend pool devices is for inbound access and round robin distribution to those devices from the public internet. But Azure Load Balancer resources also provide a egress from those backend pool devices to the public internet. So they provide NAT functionality. So the traditional way that you provide NAT on your clusters is that you NAT outbound access from workloads running on private IP addresses in the cluster to the public internet. You NAT those through the service load balancer on your cluster, which maps to an Azure load balancer. So NAT gateway is a more sort of surgical in terms of functionality. It's a smaller set of functionality, Azure resource that is focused. I don't want to say only on this, but mostly on this. There might be some additional functionality, but the reason you use NAT gateway is just for NAT. And so it's slightly lighter touch in terms of configuration. It's less complex than configuring a load balancer service for outbound NAT. It also, because it's built for that, it also, I believe, has more operational performance characteristics. For example, it can handle higher throughput. It can handle more backend, the one-to-many relationships of the NAT IP to devices behind it is greater, so you can have more private IPs in the pool using that public IP. I think that's the sort of value proposition of the NAT gateway.
And to
Does that explain it?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Jack. Now, the practical need of the NAT gateway to be enabled in any cluster is the user is looking to reach out to internet to bring back some binaries and have it installed on the cluster for whatever good reason. For example,
that's one use case. Yeah, if for whatever reason you might need outbound access.
Understood. So
what if, yeah.
Sure. So what if, let's say, in the name of we making our cluster totally private, so much so that if there is a need of having some binary install, let this binary be made available through some company restricted virtual machine, which possibly be sitting next to this AKS cluster network. And we necessarily need not have to go out of the enterprise network and to download from internet. So if this is our constraints, then we are really looking for this NAT gateway not to be created. And hence the very need of CAPZ auto-creating this NAT gateway, assigning a public IB will be really eliminated and our problem will be solved. Is there any hack where we can stop CAPZ to have this NAT gateway auto-creating?
Yeah, this is not a hack at all. So this is, again, the same exact story. So what I would advise you to do is to get Cluster API and CAPZ out of the picture and figure out the AKS configuration that fulfills your requirements. So just use the whatever your preferred workflow of choice is: command line, ARM template, biceps, portal, whatever. But work out the specific AKS cluster configuration that fulfills your requirements. Get that ironed out. There's no NAT gateway. There's no public IP. Everything looks great. Get that sorted out, and then carry that configuration into the CAPZ frontier, so to speak. But the first step is to understand from an AKS perspective exactly how to get the cluster configuration that you desire. How do you define that? And then once you get there, because that's a totally separate set of work from the really boring, annoying like translation work where you translate one API spec into another that looks 95% the same but slightly different. So that's a different phase of your discovery work that you're going to need to do later. But the first thing is to figure out how does my AKS cluster, how do I configure an AKS cluster so it actually does what I want it to do?
With you. but still you are requiring, once we figure it out, we should stop using the plain vanilla CAPI, CAPZ generating YAML templates, but rather we should immediately jump into ASO-based templates, which gives the entirety of the configuration that any AKS-based clusters or VMS-based cluster can provide to user to tinker with. Is that your recommendation?
That's right. That's right. There's two exceptions. One exception is maybe your configuration is totally covered by the legacy API. In that exception, I would still recommend you use the new APIs because that's the direction the project is going. We don't have any plans to continue to add new functionality to the legacy APIs. And so at some point, you'll probably get stuck. So that's one asterisk. The second asterisk is it's possible that that part of the configuration that you require is very, very new in AKS and is a month or two away from being available in CAPZ. So if that's, I don't think that's the case based on what you're describing. I think these are all, I think there is probably the scenario you're describing in terms of having a private cluster with no public IPs and no outbound access. That is, in my experience, a pretty standard enterprise set of requirements, and I'm confident that AKS has fulfilled those requirements for a long time. And so these are not new AKS features. But in the event that something that you need is actually new, there's a possibility that the ASO hasn't published an API with that yet, and or that CAPZ hasn't consumed the latest ASO API. So I'm trying, I know I'm making things more complex than I need to. I'm just giving the full sort of lawyerly overview here.
Sure.
But the short answer is yes. Go find out exactly what you need, how you need to build your AKS clusters. And then when you go to integrate Cluster API and CAPZ into that, use the new CAPZ Azure ASO managed cluster, Azure ASO managed control plane CRDs.
Understood. And these set of ASO things are supported by your team, or we can take this implementation to any company's production environment?
I don't quite understand the last part. They are supported by the maintainers of the project, yes.
Is it generally available? It is supported. If something goes wrong, will we get any help or anything of that sort?
What do you feel like this is helpful? This is the way that we provide help. Yes.
Yeah. It's all open source, so this is what. Yeah.
Understood. Anything documentation support, or if we need some joint troubleshooting, if something is very niche and we are not able to figure out, that sort of help. Enterprise may be
100%, and up to and including there might be bugs in there. If there are documentation gaps, we can address that. We can prioritize and address those either in collaboration with folks like yourself. We can come up with new documentation. Yeah, the point is that this API, the key point is that this API is alpha, which really what that means is that it hasn't been around long enough where we're willing to guarantee that the API itself won't break. So when we create an API, we anticipate and we expect and we hope that the API, once we expose it to users, won't change. But based on user feedback and real world usage, the correct sort of process for this is if folks start using the API and say, you know, this is actually not working for us, it would work better if it looked like this. If the API is in an alpha state, we're open to considering changing the API. And then you go through a baking process. And then once you graduate to beta, I know this is a funny world we live in where beta means GA, but that's just the world we live in. So when you graduate to beta, then what we're telling the sort of rules around that is that the API must never change. So we don't want to put the API into that posture until we put a little mileage on it, because that contract is serious. And so if we do that prematurely and we find out that, oh, actually, if the users aren't using this API because they needed this and this and this, and we can't change it anymore. So we want to keep it in an alpha state for a certain period of time, get user feedback on what those APIs look like. And we have some flexibility to change that if that's what users are telling us that they want, how they want that API to evolve before it. But this is sort of I don't want to say it's a warning, it's just a clarification of the state of the APIs. But they're from a support standpoint, from the community maintainership, like we're fully committed to maintaining this API just equivalently with other APIs, with the only asterisk that we have permission with our community to change the APIs in alpha if there's a good reason to do so. Beta APIs, we must not change those. That's part of the contract.
Understood. And your team or whosoever has authored these ASO-based specs being inspired by, let's say, if someone is creating AKs or VM-based cluster on Azure manually or AZCLA or Bicep or ARM template, it actually auto-generates the underlying JSON objects. So, I mean, if someone is looking to have such created manually, get the auto-generated JSON template downloaded, and then decipher what maps to the ASO-based spec, will that, okay, you thumbs up. Okay, I got the answer.
That's 100%. That you just described the effort. That's what's required. So unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice if that JSON was the first class input. You didn't have to do any deciphering, but there is deciphering involved. You take that JSON blob and you're just like, hey, this is literally the sort of integral JSON representation of this object. And now you go and you convert that to ASO, which I'm not aware that there's It's possible. It would be possible to automate that, but I'm not aware that there's any automation.
You already answered that question. I actually was braving enough to ask this question, like, is there any hack to automate or have any tool to have the JSON object created into the ASO-based object or spec?
Yeah, I would actually ask that question in the Azure Service Operator project. So I'll bring up a link.
Okay. And that being proctored by the SIG team or the Microsoft team?
This is a separate team inside. I'm pretty sure they're heavily embedded in AKS, but it's a separate team from the community that manages CAPZ. So you can pose an issue there with your use case and just maybe get a couple of votes and.
Okay, they who authored the ASO.
Correct. Those are the maintainers of ASO.
Okay, fine. And Jack, as a kind of challenge, we were also looking to conquer or explore the last most resort, meaning in a particular GitHub repo, and I can post that link. This question was not well drafted, but then let's focus on the link which I just now dropped. This is the link we initially, got navigated from within the CAPZ official documentation webpage, where it has list of all the templates. The link which I've dropped, we assumed this is the AKS-based management cluster specific generic template, but then it has some specs, but we were looking to have some template which defines the entirety of the schema definition supported by CAPZ specifically for AKS-based cluster. So the link which I have pasted, is that the schema definition specific template, or it's a subset of it? Because who knows?
No, I can answer that. It's definitely not a schema definition. That's a reference template that we use to do development on AKS clusters. And to be specific, there's no management cluster aspect of that either. The idea there is for a developer can use a rapid file watching environment tool, sort of like what's the GitHub equivalent? Spaces, is that what it's called? But there's an open source project called Tilt that kind of mimics that flow. And that when you're in that development environment, that is a reference template that you can use to create an AKS cluster on the fly to do rapid development in CAPZ.
Or other way of saying this is, sorry to interject to Jack, or other way of saying like this is a subset of the schema definition, which actually CAPZ auto-generates when we run that command. I mean, whenever we want to create a target cluster of the type AKS or VMSs or any kind of cluster. It's a sample template, not the...
That is, yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
So trying to find out where are the CRDs. So in the somewhere in the CAPZ repository is a link to the CRD spec for the. So let me the first thing is that excuse me. First thing is that definitely that link, that AKS.YAML link, cluster template AKS, is definitely not the definitive schema. So answers that question. And the definitive schema is essentially a light wrapping around ASO. So as I sort of demoed at the beginning, the definitive schema is really documented in the ASO reference docs. You just have to do some cross-referencing, and you have to formulate your YAML in such a way where you give it that little wrapping and you point it to a very specific ASO version. But then in that spec is essentially a totally transparent wrapping of the underlying ASO reference spec. So I feel like we kind of spoke to that earlier, if that makes sense. Did that land with you earlier in the discussion?
Yes, Jack. But if you can please help share, not right away, but then whenever you get time, the schema definitions for the AKs as well as the VMSA-based cluster, which we'll get to see all the allowed attributes or properties that we can play with. We would like to see.
So when you say VMSS, you mean not AKS, like a self-managed cluster.
That is correct. That is correct.
Right. Yeah, there's no easy reference for that. What do I want to say here? Yeah, there's no easy reference for that, unfortunately.
Okay, how about the
for the second one? Okay. Because there's no for the self-managed one.
Understood.
You'll have to read the documentation and read the underlying specs in the CAPC source, the API specs, and figure out all of the configuration that's available. There's nothing. The reason this is true is because you can compose lots of different machine pools or machine deployments or machine sets. You can wrap them in cluster classes. There's a lot of different ways to do this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to provide a simple documentation that says, here's the full set of combinatorics that you can use to create a self-managed cluster.
Okay, and how about
AKS is different because AKS is a finite thing, and it's defined in the AKS APIs, and then the ASO representation of that is defined in that link to the ASO API.
Understood. Can we get at least the AKS based the schema link?
Yeah, it's in the chat there.
Okay.
It's the one that's I'll take it again. So here is the set of managed cluster APIs and managed clusters agent pool APIs that are supported. So depending on which one you decide to use in the CAPZ spec, that would be your reference starting point.
Okay, we'll go through it. Thanks.
Cool. More questions? There must be more questions.
No more questions, but Jack, we might reach out to you through Slack if there is any issues or anything.
Yeah, please. Yeah, there will definitely be issues.
Okay.
That's not the easiest thing in the world to do this stuff.
But the good thing is, we're working together, we'll figure it out, because as you rightly said, that these are enterprise requirements. So whatever problem that we are trying to solve, we'll make sure that we will provide some kind of documentation so that other teams or the future team, they can reuse it.
That would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if you have a Microsoft Azure AKS representation. I don't know if you have a field rep that you can work through the AKS requirements, but the first phase of your work is definitely going to be to figure out exactly how to shape your AKS clusters the way you want them to before you worry about CAPZ or cluster API.
Okay.
And so for that, really AKS is the best. We can definitely offer to help, but we're not going to be experts there on the AKS side. So we'll probably refer you to AKS.
All right.
Cool.
I think we are done.
All right. We can move on to what looks like our last topic, which is Jack is asking if we should do this every other week rather than every week, because if you scroll back here, we've skipped probably every other one. I mean, that seems to be sort of a natural.
I think that's
yeah.
the observation. I mean, obviously by having them every week, it's the most accommodating to the user community. So definitely want to get folks feedback on this. And but I think that ideally all of the meetings are like this one, where we've got lots of really great, dense discussions, and we've got enough folks in the audience so that the community and other users are able to participate and answer questions. And I think that having slightly less regularity meetings is more likely to produce that, because you're going to get more folks coming to the meeting. Yeah, I think that my observation is that this would be a better, that the type of content, the expected content that we've tracked over the past couple of years tracks more with SIGs and various meetings in CNCF that I've observed that are biweekly instead of weekly. Additionally, CAPI is weekly, I think for good reason, and there's lots of folks that still go to those meetings, and so that is a good place if you're in between, like availability for CAPZ office hours, to pop in there and see if anyone in CAPZ is around and ask a CAPZ related question if you can't wait another week. But I'll either myself or assign to someone on the community maintainer list the task of editing. I think we've got this documented, and so we can just edit the doc to propose a new cadence and ask for feedback from the community and set a lazy consensus. And then maybe by September, we'll be doing these every other week if folks agree.
Yeah, I'm a little on the fence just because what often happens on a Thursday is we show up, there's only one thing or not many things on the agenda, but then turns out actually some people had a lot of questions, and so it's great that we were there. But overall, it seems like we could every other week probably fits what actually happens better than this, so I'm totally amenable to it.
Jack, if I may, is there any publicly accessible video channels somewhere which this team, the SIG team and or the Microsoft team who authored this ASO-based spec created? If not at the raw implementation level, at least they can talk through.
You know, your best resource actually is the doc that Matt is sharing, which is a really big, long living historical document. If you scroll down, at some point in the past 6 months or so, you'll see some meetings that have agenda items with ASO, and each meeting should, now this might not always be true, but each meeting should have a recording link. And so look in the history here for discussion items that are of interest to you, and click on the recording link, and you should be able to watch the recording. I know there's at least one demo in the last several months of the ASO APIs by John Hune, the lead developer on that.
Yeah.
I mean, the notes which Matt is writing currently.
What's that?
This is the notes which Matt is writing right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shareable link, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Just a Google Doc, yeah.
Sure.
And then we try to recording every time, and we put a link to it right here. There's a YouTube channel that all the meetings that we've recorded are linked to, but it's also for SIG cluster lifecycle. So there's a lot of meetings that are not exactly on topic. They're not CAPZ. And on YouTube, I have also seen several here and there videos about here's what Azure Service Operator is, but I don't know if they're linked in any coherent fashion. But you might find something on YouTube that is better at explaining sort of what ASO is and how it works. But we also have a demo in here somewhere.
Sure. Matt, if you can please help drop this link on this ongoing chat, that will be helpful.
The link to this document or to?
Yeah, I mean, wherever we can get to all the
this chat will disappear. It's actually better to, so in CAPZ Slack, on Kubernetes Slack, are you on that? Are you in cluster-API-Azure?
No, I will be.
Okay, so you'll want to join Kubernetes Slack and save this link, because all this is going to disappear once this meeting is closed, I think.
Well, the chat will disappear, but we try to type down. type in most of the relevant stuff too.
And there's a Slack bot, and that always posts a link to the agenda doc for CAPZ. And it's also linked on the Cluster API provider Azure Git repo landing page.
Yep. All right. Is that clear enough?
Yep.
Cool. So Jack, you're going to task somebody with maybe proposing the meeting change, and then we'll move forward from there. Okay. So I think that's all we had on the agenda.
Thanks for taking thorough notes, Matt.
Oh, of course. Here's where we sometimes visit milestone, but I'm going to propose we don't because we're a little short on time. It's probably not that interesting to the general audience. So if that's cool with everybody, let's call it good for today. And we will see you here next week because we are not yet bi-weekly, I assume. So
yeah, I think that's fair.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for all the good questions, guys. That was really great.
I was almost forgetting to ask one thing, if I may.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sure. So when we do Google search of any issues which we are encountering, we do that wide search. But is there any GitHub repo specific issue channels where we first should be looking up to for any sort of CAPZ specific errors we encountering?
Yeah, just the CAPZ and the CAPI repos.
Okay.
Yeah, the issues queue and CAPZ first, and then CAPI.
Sure.
All right. Let's call it here. Happy Thursday, everybody.
Thank you,
See you
guys.
soon.
Everyone. Bye.
Thank you.